Record, my brother, what's going on?
Nick, how you doing? I'm okay. I'm okay. Thanks for asking.
Good. Hey, do you remember like 2 years ago, we were at this thing in Cleveland at Case Western, and my colleague, my brilliant colleague Ahmed Abbasi, did this presentation, and it was
hmm
really cool. I mean, I thought it was a super unique and subversive presentation that really changed things, right?
It changed for me. Yeah.
And we were both excited, and you kept bugging me for 2 years now to get him on the podcast. And he kept saying no until the thing's published. So finally, I don't even think it's published yet, but at least it's accepted and you can get. But Ahmed, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, Nick's actually right. I mean, that paper, I don't know whether you guys get this so often, but I don't have it that often that I go to a workshop or a conference and I see a paper presentation. In fact, I didn't even know it was a paper back then. I see a presentation and they're just it's riveting and like stays in your head for a long time. We were all at AOM a couple of weeks ago. I remember next to nothing from that conference anymore, right? But your presentation from 2 years ago about effectively on, A/B tests and what's really going on, with A/B tests at Amazon and Google and Bing and all, LinkedIn and all these big tech companies. I was like, wow, that's such a deal breaker to me. Anyway, so we're really glad to have you, man.
No, it's glad to be here, and thanks for that reaction 2 years ago. And it's been a long time coming, but I'm excited to talk about it. I think the paper is forthcoming now, and so it can be accessed through MISQ's website, I believe.
Well, we'll put a link on the show notes. But just one story about that Case Western workshop from 2 years ago. I don't know whether you guys even remember or even know this in the first place. So, Clay, you guys organized a little computational social science workshop and invite a bunch of people to come to Cleveland for like a day and present a work. And I talked about I think processual data. You did your stuff on A/B testing and so forth. What you guys may or may not remember, I was coming from Montreal, right? I was coming from Canada the night before. And to get from Montreal to Cleveland, you have to go via Toronto. And then you take this little shitty plane that hops across the lake and lands in Cleveland. But of course, it's a border in between. And the flight to Toronto was delayed. And then there was huge queue at the immigration, etc. So I scrambled to make my flight, which was the last in the evening. And I just about made it by, cutting the lines and everything.
Wait, Record, why are we listening to this travel story?
So, but my suitcase didn't. So that
Oh,
I had no underwear. I had no night things, anything. I had nothing. So I arrived at Youngjin's place and he waited for me with a little joke. And his joke is that he gave me a t-shirt where he had imprinted, I flew all the way to Cleveland. All I got was this t-shirt and a 30-minute slot to present my paper. And it was meant to be a joke, but it turned out to be the only piece of clothes that was fresh and I could wear it at
that
the
you had.
workshop the next day.
Yeah. Well, all right. Well, it took a long time to get to the end of that story. Uh, all right. So here's the deal. We're going to talk about Abbasi's paper, but I
Yeah.
also want to talk about a couple of other things that are interesting. But as far as the paper goes, this is what it's about, just to give people at least my very basic thumbnail, right? A/B testing, it's all over industry, happens in academia. When we use A/B testing to test theories, we're screwing up and we can't really test any theories with A/B testing. Is that a good encapsulation, Emmett?
Yeah, no, and I think the preferred term that most academics and even in industry they use is randomized control trials would be what they like to call it. But yes,
Right.
it's A/B testing from the Miranda et al. Paper. You guys talk about it there. That's the gist of it. Yeah.
And but all right, so two things. If I'm doing it in industry, that's a little different because I'm not trying to isolate effective variables on variables. I'm just trying to make my platform better. So A/B testing in industry is probably fine, but A/B testing in academia, or if you're planning to test actually hypotheses, it's not a valid test. That's why this is so subversive. We have a decade of testing hypotheses with essentially randomized control trials or A/B testing, right?
And it's an important area for us, right? We've all talked about the importance of diversity of different methods. We right now There's a lot of work on causal inference from observational data, and I think we can
Yeah.
all agree that it's good. It's randomized control trials and field experiments with A/B testing is a really important area. And there was a really cool article saying we need more of it, right? And that was also in MISQ a few years ago.
Yeah.
Elena and Ravi have a great paper. And I think I use A/B testing all the time. I do a lot of design research where you want to test the downstream operational utility. And that's how we sort of stumbled upon this. We were working on that. I work a lot with Silicon Valley companies, as well as telcos and big, in pharmaceuticals and testing design artifacts. That's usually what I do. And about 8 years ago, we were looking at this and started to get into these digital experimentation platforms that these companies use. And the backstory there is also quite fascinating, right? And we do touch upon this in the paper, but 20 years ago, you could not get a product manager at a big tech company to run an A/B test, to do anything with data-driven decision making, because it was all about their intuition, right? And
Mhm.
the way that it became big, and there's a really cool HBR article that we also cite in our paper that Ronnie Kohavi and company wrote, where they talk about how this sort of evolved, right? And really, it went from not being able to get people to do these things to having the size of the box problem, where everyone in industry wants to use A/B testing to validate whatever they want to do, right? And of course, some of that comes with this whole cultural aspect where you want to get ahead in your career, you want to do things that make you look good, you want to be a data-driven person if you're at these companies. So they ended
Yeah.
up going from having no demand to having this size of the box problem where the number of experiments they could run was limited. They could only still run a few hundred at a time per week. Uh, and people wonder, well, why is that possible? Like, how is that possible, right? You've got billions of user sessions, but it's so noisy, right? We know that the online user session data, so you need millions and hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of sessions to have the
Yeah.
statistical power, right?
Yeah.
So with this size of the box problem, they basically said, hey, look, we're going to use these digital experimentation platforms with this idea called orthogonal testing planes, which there's some really good papers about it where they talk about how they're going to do it. And it was essentially this idea
Going back
that,
to Fisher, right?
yeah. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
That's actually my
right.
favorite. One of my favorite things is that you actually went back and read Fisher, the godfather of experiments, right? 1935, and you bring up
Right.
his.
Yeah, and our one of our colleagues here at Ken Kelly, who Nick and I's good colleague. I mean, he's a huge Ronald Fisher fan, and so yes, and what's fascinating, which we thought was really cool, was that these testing planes, the way they visualize it, the way they describe it in the papers, looks very similar to the original Rothamsted Station 1856 park grass experiments. And when I saw that, the visuals, and I thought this is incredible. And we've basically come full circle. And that was kind of one of the punchlines of
Well,
the paper.
real quick, let's go back to the randomized control trials now in industry and the testing plane issue. But before you do that, what was Fisher doing? So I see these plots of land, and what were they doing? How is this
Well,
interesting?
yeah,
Sorry,
go ahead.
in my recollection, they were testing different, ways of fertilizing soil, right? And they divided basically a park into different lots. And at the same time, said like, well, you use that much nitrogen here and a different quantity there. And on the third lot, I'll use, something else, etc. And set up basically an ongoing parallelized experiment with a whole bunch of lots where they wanted to, test which one was the best way of fertilizing the soil. Is that correct? And what they realized over time is, of course, that there are interaction effects if between these lots. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, it's quite literally the longest running field experiment in the world. And they have these lots, and they're basically trying different lime treatments, nitrogen, et cetera, et cetera. And what they discovered, though, and why it's so important for modern science is that was where people like Ronald Fisher and others went and realized that the way in which this was being done was kind of arbitrary. They didn't have randomization. There was confounding because if it rained, the treatment might spill over to an
Yeah,
adjacent lot, which
exactly.
is supposed to
Yeah.
have a different treatment. And so that's where modern ideas about factorial design, randomization, confounding were uncovered. And all the things we're not supposed to do were sort of identified, right? And to see 170 years later or whatever, us going kind of full circle and back to this idea of the size of the box. What ended up happening is industry said, hey, look, we're okay having some level of interactions where we're going to allow people to be in multiple treatments within the same user session, right? And this is, I should point out, this is not all A/B testing, right? This is only organizations using large-scale digital experimentation platforms, which is really, but it's a lot. It's the big tech companies all over the world, and increasingly others. They're influencing a lot of other industries as well to say, hey, this is a solution we can use to overcome this bottleneck we have, right? Even with clinical drug trials, they're trying to incorporate this idea. And their hope was that, hey, we're going to hopefully not have too much. We're going to try to do what we can to manage the interactions by setting some rules about how this can happen, right? So it's not just like, hey, we're just going to randomly do it, but basically it was to allow a lot more experiments to happen concurrently.
So I want to shift that perspective a little bit, because you look basically at, okay, how did this involve in industry? But I want to look at it from the perspective of, okay, how do we used to do experiments in science or in IS, if you want to think about it, right? So 20 years ago, if I look back when I did my PhD, it's like, okay, experiments were always been the gold standard, right? Randomized controlled trial, best way of checking for internal validity, causality, blah, blah, blah. And of course, even back then, field experiments was the super gold standard, but early 2000, next to impossible to do for the reason you mentioned. Like, even if you had great contact to a firm, nowhere in hell would they allow you to intervene in their ongoing operations. Yeah, and like in their platforms back then, in their products or anything like this. Most of the companies wouldn't even allow you, because it's an experiment. It might go wrong. You might lose out on sales or whatever else. So for a long time, I would say, like, lab experiments were the gold standard. Field experiment was this theoretical ideal. Now, then that became more and more possible with the advent of A/B testing, with the firms doing it themselves. Then we had the golden days, right? We had the golden days in two ways. Number one was the rise of MTurk and these sort of online experimentation platforms that superseded or succeeded these. I take a bunch of students for $20 and put them in my lab in the university and just run the thing online, right? That was one. And then, we saw more and more field experiments. I would say about 2010, 2015, right? We saw more and more actual field experiments. And a couple of them were really good. With the eBays of this world, Isaac did a lot of them, and, other people as well. And now we're getting to this problem that, the heydays are over. Because we let ourselves, be a bit slippery, I guess. Because now what I would wager most people don't even know about orthogonal test plans, and they don't even know that while they're running their A/B test on their very important theoretical contribution they want to establish, that at the same time, the users that they ask are also simultaneously in 250 other A/B tests that have nothing to do with your science, but the company's running them anyway. Is that fair to say, or being overly negative?
No, I think it's definitely something we need to look at. And that's really why we position this as an issues and opinions paper instead of a method paper, because methodologically, the way to correct this, and this goes back to something all three of us were talking about before I guess we started recording, is we took the ideas of user heterogeneity, this concept, double machine learning. Nick and Shriram and Jason and others, they have a really cool paper on that as well in a different context. And user heterogeneity, I mean, Ravi Buckner wrote a really seminal paper in MISQ on that in 2003 that we all cite. The idea is that, we have these different subgroups with different effect sizes, right? And we took that idea and we applied that here, but for what we call session heterogeneity. The idea is that you can experience different co-occurring treatments, which means you are in a different subgroup based on the portfolio or combination of treatments you experience, which and I think what we did in this paper, which previously hasn't been done, people in industry even started talking about this, and in academia in the last few years. And we actually presented it at MIT Code a few years ago, and the reception was lukewarm. But within a year after our presentation, a lot of big name people were talking about this, academics and industry folks as well. But what we did was, we tried to identify the extent of the issue. And that's what's really surprising, right? We found that in multiple settings, we focus on one case study in the paper, but we did this in multiple organizations. A user in a 5-minute session, you can experience 6, 7, 8 different treatments, right? That's a lot, right? I think we can all agree that's quite a bit. the world's a noisy place, right? And
And the
field experiments.
randomization doesn't take care of that. The fact that everyone is randomly assigned to multiple treatments. I mean, isn't that the whole idea that then that's what takes care of it, right? Right.
That's right. And that's what we all want to believe. But the
Yeah.
challenge is this: if you have treatment interaction effects, right? So if my focal treatment, what I care about as a scientist, let's focus on, the implications we think are far greater for science than they are for
I agree. Yeah.
practical industry. And because industry, look, they believe that if I have 80% good data or whatever, good effect sizes are 80% right, that's better than nothing, right? So that's
Yeah.
sort of how they're approaching it. But for us, biased estimation is a problem, right? And so if you have a treatment interaction effect, then the randomized, which means that it only happens when my focal treatment interacts with something else that was not supposed to be there. Randomization can't solve that. And that's something we talk about. And that's something that's often very misunderstood. People just assume that it does. The analogy I would use is many of us have done behavioral research experiments, right? It's kind of like if I have a factorial design where let's assume I have a 2 by 2 by 2 factorial design, right? So I've got 8 possible settings. If all 3 settings being on, like the treatment, like one of those 8 settings has some interaction effect. And if I just take the average effect of any individual treatment, I don't consider that interaction effect significantly. This is like basic, stats 101. We know that then we have biased estimation. And that's what's happening. And that's what we found, that if you account for the session heterogeneity, so not only are there 8 of these on average, 6 to 8 treatments people are experiencing, 30% of those treatment interactions are significant many times, and
Wow.
it varies. And then what are the implications? Finally, what's the implication if I have a focal treatment? The biased estimation can happen in 50, 60, 70% of the time. It's not only biased, it's significant. So we call biased estimation where the actual effect size when you correct for this is significantly different, and often if the directionality changes, right? So those, we
Mhm.
all agree, those are big things. We theorize around the directionality and the effect size, and if
Yeah.
those are being impacted. But not only that, here's the real kicker. We noted a positivity bias too. So not only is the estimation biased, but more likely than not, we found that 4 or 5 times it's more likely to be a positivity bias where the effect, it appears to be more positive than it actually is.
And is that because of the sample size, or why is that?
Well, again, we don't know for sure, but what we hypothesized is that, the way these experiments get approved is there is a process. If people are, my joke is, if you're tired of being in academia because you get rejected all the time, they do have a peer review process for experiments getting approved, because even with the size of the box, they do have governance committees, and we've analyzed data for how these things happen. It's a fascinating process, but some of these experiments go through many rounds of revise and resubmit before they get approved. But the
Hmm.
point is, you're running experiments in batches, and so in your particular batch, it could be that if one of the experiments is really strong, it's going to lift up a whole bunch of them, right?
Yeah.
And so you end up with this we think it's a positivity bias based on the selection of which experiments get approved
Right.
for
Right.
being run.
Yeah. And you haven't tested that, but that's your hunch. All right, real quick. So if I'm aware of this now and I have some data, I go to one of these big tech companies and we get their data, and it's like, all right, I want to test some hypotheses on these treatments. Is the only way to do it really get at heterogeneous treatments where you account for every single interaction?
Well, I don't think that's even possible, right? How is that? That's not going to be possible. But you would have to know all of them and anticipate all of them. You can't possibly know in the first hand.
Right. It's hard. I mean, the reason we were one of the first to do such a large scale in the case study we had, I think we have, in order for us to analyze close to 30 what we called focal experiments, where we say, okay, let's assume these 30 are like us trying to test something out. We have to collect every experiment that's interacting with these focal experiments, right? And so in our case, it ends up being close to 400 experiments. So it's like a
All right.
network, right? Graph. We have the 27. We have to go one hop, right? We have to get everything that's interacting with it. So for those 400 experiments, it was about 2 billion user sessions. And it just to collect this, we had to, I mean, these are massive big data platforms, and we did this in a few different contexts, but it took us several months just to collect that data. And the challenge you run into is as Jan alluded to, it's really hard. You have to run these reports after the fact to do it. And so, and the managers, it can be tough for them. So we do talk about that. That's one strategy you can employ, where you say, okay, I'm working with you as a researcher. I want to publish this paper in some upcoming special issue. Can I need one hop of data. The other thing, the best thing we recommend is asking for a dedicated testing plane where if you have
that's
enough
a good
social
idea.
capital.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the number one thing. And that's sort of like what we all try to do, right? So in our case,
And you mean an independent separate, right? If they have all their test plans, you want to have one that is literally independent, like
yes, where
not
you're like,
wannabe
hey,
and yeah,
exactly. You're like, look, I don't want these users to be in any other settings, but it's got to be they have to randomly be assigned to this. They can't just be the people that happen to not want to do anything else, right? So it's random assignment. And then you can argue the randomization will take care of it. But there's a whole list of things we mentioned. But yes, one of them is running session heterogeneity if you have to.
So I think this is I think why it lingered on. So like this is important, right? I mean, this is one of the key methods that we actually use. I remember like a couple of years ago, we did a paper on null hypothesis significance testing, right? Classical hypothetical deductive research in IS, and we looked at 100 most cited papers, and we have survey experiment, and we see this incline. We do see more and more of these types of papers being published, and that number is growing. You have a similar chart in your appendix as well, I believe. So it's really important. Also, I've been personally, I wanted to see a paper on how to do digital experiments for a long time, like because of I think the hunch that many people feel like it's not the same, right? It's not the same. It is in a way. It's like action research meets experiments, isn't it? I mean, like you're working with a firm in the live operations. It's not as simple as that you're being allowed to switch something on and off on a web page. I mean, it's just not as simple as that. So it's good to see this paper coming out. Now, I wanted to test a couple of propositions here, right? So Nick on this podcast has argued repeatedly saying like IS researchers shouldn't do A/B tests. And I think his main argument has always been that, Google is running it. What do you think you can compete with that? Is that fair, Nick?
Well, all right. So you're mischaracterizing me a little. It's not that we shouldn't run A/B tests. It's that theoretical A/B tests. What the hell are you going to do with an theoretical A/B test, right? You're going to do weak industry research, right? So the only thing we have going for us is theory. So if you're going to do an A/B test, have some strong theory. Now you get Abbasi's work and it's like, you can have strong theory, but unless you're going to get a dedicated plane or some really sophisticated techniques, you're actually not testing your theory with your A/B test. You're just doing some gymnastics, right? So that's the tough part.
The other way that I look at it, it's sort of like I look at it with a laughing eye and a crying eye. I don't know whether that saying makes sense in English, but sort of like as an experimentalist, this is classic. Okay, we're improving science here, right? Every 5-10 years, we're figuring out that we've been doing something wrong, that we've been overestimating, our confidence in results, etc. We see this all the time, right? So, and it's good that that's how science progresses, that we keep on updating and critically inspecting our methods. So that's one way to look at it. But of course, the conclusions are a bit sad, aren't they? I mean, in a way, we said, like, look, if you can't establish a separate test plan, you're better off not doing that. You're better off not working with these firms. You're better off going back to the lab, etc. And that's kind of sad because as someone that works with firms, that's incredibly tough. And anyone saying it's going to be even tougher is going to, deter even more people from doing this type of work. I mean, and isn't what we do like that we stay real close to practice? Isn't that what we all want? You know where I'm getting with this?
Yeah, no. And I think this was sort of something that the reviewers really pushed us on as well, right? This notion that is this going to become a gatekeeping paper? I think we all agree that we need except for Nick, perhaps, but the rest of us agree we need a diversity of methods, right? And I think I do think randomized control trials are really important. Jan, you alluded to this earlier, and we mentioned this, and when I present this, if you go into like any health sciences book, like in the medical field, and I know that's different from IS, but in the medical field, they have this pyramid, and it's like
Yeah.
And they call it like the epistemic superiority type thing of different methods.
Yeah.
And the thing at the top of that pyramid in terms of purity of effect and the best method is randomized control trial. In fact, the only thing above that in this pyramid is a
It's meta-analysis.
meta-analysis
Yeah.
of multiple randomized control trials, right? And then observational is actually below that. And I know in our fields it's become the other way, and that's totally fine. I mean, in information systems, marketing, OM, et cetera, observational is now perhaps considered as good or better. And so a few different things. One, we don't want this to be just hardcore gatekeeping where we just go back to hunting for an identification strategy on our observational data as the only way to path to tenure, right? That's not healthy. And I think that so the mindfulness aspect is important. We definitely do think we want to be mindful, but it's also an opportunity, I think, for IS. We've always been so randomized control trials. This phenomena is not just an IS thing, right? This is, and we talk about this. There's a lot of papers in management science, I mean, marketing and OM and other fields. A lot of people are doing this, and we hope that this is an opportunity for us to offer thought leadership on this, right? Like how to do this, how to design it, what are the guidelines. But at the same time, from a scientific transparency standpoint, in addition to all the things you alluded to about the difficulty of doing this and whatnot, Jan, one other thing to note is it's also really hard for review teams. I mean, all three of us are editors, right? It's really hard for a review team to push authors further on papers that are using these types of partnership-based randomized control trials, right? It's because they don't usually have access to the billions or millions or billions of underlying sessions. So that's another piece of this. So we do think that this issue, and in some ways you could argue that with observational or other types of experiments or other qualitative research, maybe even, there's an opportunity for greater transparency. So that makes this issue even more problematic on that hand. So we weren't trying to make this a gatekeeping thing, but we do think that we have to be careful about producing science that's not accurate.
I have two follow-up questions. I mean, the one is when I read through your implications for research, right? So sort of like, okay, we see the problem. What do we do now? I mean, in a way, you give the usual answer, which is mixed method is better. Of course it is, right? So in a way, you could say, like, if you can't establish that separate test plan that you talked about for your scientific experiment, I mean, the other option that I see is that you want to go and do your field experiment, but you always also want to follow it up with a very controllable lab experiment, just to test whether the effect that you observed holds up in a more controllable fashion, right? That seems to be make perfect sense. So in a way,
or
that
go
means
talk to
that
people, or but that whole idea of corroboration, triangulation, absolutely, right?
yeah.
And I think the other answer is theory, isn't it? Because if we actually have a abstracted cumulative tradition, then we can draw on that. We can make bold, testable conjecture, and then every little study is, if you have strong theory, an A/B test with some issues would be, all right, here's some validity, some findings that don't contradict my theory, but it doesn't prove it. There's nothing that I'm necessary. It's like Popper. It's not, I can never verify a theory. I can just disprove a theory, right? I can falsify a theory. So I set up some conditions. I didn't falsify it with this, and my theory is strong, right? And then future papers can draw. This is the whole purpose of theory. This is the difference between being abstracted empiricism, I think Sutton and Stahl called it, which is just all we're doing is empirical. And when it's abstracted empiricism, then your empirics have to be perfect. And if you have strong theory and a cumulative tradition, any particular study, the empirics should be good as you can get. But the trick is to just point out that it doesn't contradict my theory, and then you build a tradition. You build a cumulative tradition. I think that's the problem with being too enamored with only the empirical side, right?
Yeah, no, I think all of the above is how I would respond to that. Everything you both said, but I think with the theory thing, the challenge here could also be if is it inductive versus deductive. I mean, you do see you could what if you end up with the perfect A/B test where, and what I mean by that is it's just the theorizing part just works so well. Like you can go bottom up and build a great theory around it, right? So I think we have to be mindful of, this is something I've been saying in some of my other editorials and things as well, about these availability biases, right? And that's sort of, we just have to go beyond them. And availability biases manifest in different ways. For observational data, it's that, hey, I have the perfect identification strategy. Oh, a natural experiment happened. The platform changed how it does something. And then there's
all right, let me back you up here. Let me give you some background for this. So Recker, Abbasi just switched papers on us. Okay, he's got this other paper, and I'm glad because I wanted to bring this up. And we get a lot of Germans listening to us, Ahmed, and these Germans like to do design research. It's an entire country of engineers, and what they want to do is design things and then publish their design, right? And you have this really cool paper that came out earlier this year. I think it was this year, right? Yeah, on design
the
research.
pathways. Yeah. With Jeff and others.
Yeah. He's got Jeff Parsons on there, Gautam, Olivia, and Supra, and it's like what a group. And you guys, this is such a thoughtful paper. It's so interesting. But one of the things you did that I've already cited it in a couple of papers, but there was Black-owned businesses on Yelp, right? Yelp is the platform. They had a little experiment where they met the perfect conditions for field experiment, right? Where they indicated that that a business was Black owned or not, and they did it differentially across the I guess it was the US when they implemented this. So it's a perfect field study for an econometrician, right? It's beautiful. So what Abbasi does, Recker, is he counts how many people are doing an experiment on this exact same data. So that's the availability bias he's talking about. And what was it? It was like 110 different research groups in the US were
on this platform with this one business. That's crazy.
Well, with this one feature, because it's, it has the identification, and there's some really good papers on that phenomenon. So, and we wanted to make sure we're not talking about it. And just to be clear, sorry, I think we're jumping multiple papers now. So this was actually in a JAIS paper. This was, I think, came out last year.
Am I mixing up my papers?
Yeah. I mixed them up too. It's a good problem to have, right? I guess
you have too many seminal papers coming out in the same year.
You're too arrogant, highly prolific. I mean, Jesus Christ, people.
No, this one's called Data Science for Social Good, but what I wanted to say about the availability, and sorry, I wasn't trying to plug multiple papers. I mean, you guys are like the kingmakers, right? So now these papers are just going to shoot up in citations. So thank you for your
we hope so.
contributions.
The podcast certainly helps Nix with his citation.
Yeah. I think you should ask all your guests to supply your T-shirts, Jan, for the next year. Like, never again will you be closeless wherever you go.
That would be good. It would be very helpful.
But with this availability bias idea, I mean, it's so that the example Nick just gave is specifically for observational data, causal inference, and yes, but we also talk about an analog for technical design research because we want to be balanced. I mean, this issue is not just for one type of research, and there again, the availability bias is too much reliance on very publicly available benchmark data sets that are used in computer science in what's called the common task framework idea. So where there's a lot of emphasis on fake news detection is one example, right? There's so many technical papers, probably too many in IS because it's readily available. And I think with randomized control trials, bringing it back to this idea, if you're succumbing to the availability, which is the platforms run an experiment and they're giving you access to it, that doesn't mean we should pursue that paper, right? It's because if you don't have all these other aspects to it, and I think that's an important part. And the same thing with theorizing. If it works, but again, even if you have a nice theory around it, there could be these other issues to think about.
I like this very much, I mean, because it resonates with something that I say very often, which is like, we do very often what's available to us, right? So we use data sets that are available. We run the experiment. We pursue topics, very generally speaking, that are more accessible or in a way easier to get to. And I don't mean this in any very negative way. It's just, it makes sense in a way with the pressure and, publish or perish paradigm, blah, blah, blah. But it runs the danger. I could never put it like this. But of course, you run into availability bias or representation bias issues because there's a lot of stuff we don't know simply because that data is harder to get. And anyone that works with them, that's still incredibly hard data, right? Nick always says, like, I'd love to see an org level survey. No one does that anymore because they're freaking hard to do. And they still, even if you do it, you still have problems. And what you're saying now is even if you do field experiment A/B test with LinkedIn, LinkedIn 5 years ago was a sure-in for a paper. If you had a paper or an experiment with LinkedIn, you could betcha your paper will be accepted. But of course, it's hard.
All right. So, and we actually have availability bias or in some forms with qualitative work, actually, when you go out and
Absolutely.
you're doing interviews and they found this, that you emphasize the negative. So when things are running efficiently and smoothly and everything's going well, notice that you don't have any qualitative papers about that, right? Because that becomes uninteresting, right? You have to find the exceptions. But all right, so let's, Ahmed, we have a whole ton of young kind of people. Many are design, and you're one of the like the biggest design science folks in the field of IS,
Yeah,
right? And you know
absolutely.
your stuff when it comes to AI and NLP and a lot of machine learning ish, but a lot of things actually, security, phishing. I mean, your record is crazy. So but you did it at a time when it wasn't quite. I get the sense as an outsider that it's like easier to publish design research now than it was maybe 10 years ago. So what advice, first of all, is that right? And what advice would you give, say, young or mid-career people that want to do AI stuff, that want to do machine learning, but want to publish in IS? What are some big issues you see as an editor, as an author?
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I can't really speak to is it easier to publish? I mean, I think if you were to look at the number of papers published in our top journals in MySQ, ISR, et cetera, it's definitely increased, right, relative to 20 years ago. I mean, the backstory, as you guys are well aware, the Heavener et al. Paper, which I think Alan Lee was at EIC at the time when he kind of commissioned it, and I think Detmar was the accepting EIC on that paper. But that paper was essentially I don't want to say commissioned, but it was sort of I mean, Alan invited Suda and Al Hebner and Sal March and company to submit it because there just wasn't enough of that paper, enough of that type of research coming. And I think there was sort of I guess, a movement in the 80s and 90s to go more, theory building, and it was more behavioral research then. And we know quantitative behavioral became the mode, and so on and so forth, right? So with that backdrop, there weren't a lot of papers. I mean, and I was a first year PhD student when the Hefner et al. Paper came out. And
Me
so I
too.
literally, yeah, so we're, and basically so there
So
weren't a
wait, you
lot.
got to
There were,
realize, Recker, you know where Abbasi went to get his PhD? He was at Arizona. So that's like kind of the
Okay. Well,
mecca for
yeah, absolutely.
design research in the US, right? So
Also felt very small in comparison. Wait, we started at the same time, and where are you and where I am now? Wow. But anyway, keep going, keep going.
yeah, I don't have nucleus in my title. I mean, that's we were talking about arrogance earlier. My goodness, no kidding.
I'm contractually obligated to actually put that there.
Well, we should. It's got to be one of the coolest titles, though, so it's awesome. No, but basically there was this. So there weren't a lot of papers, and then we finally started having SEs and AEs on boards. I mean, the boards at the top journals didn't have it. Now there was a very rich and vibrant design research culture outside of MISQ ISR before that, and we
Yeah,
tried to in this.
absolutely.
And this ISR paper that Nick alluded to, the Pathways for Design Research editorial in ISR, we made sure to kind of cite some of that because we didn't want. There's this perception that design research sort of rose from the ashes like a phoenix in 2004, like it just came about. And you see these editorials and articles that many senior scholars have written saying, "Oh, in such a short time, design research has done so much." And we're like, no. That's not how disciplines and fields and genres of research evolve, right? And so we made sure to cite the classics from the 80s and 90s and so forth, and including some of the representations, knowledge representations like Wand and Weber and all these great papers.
Yeah.
Some of them were in good journals. But so anyway, there's a rich history there. Yeah, it was tough sledding, Nick. The first, I think 10, 15 years was tough sledding. And quantitatively, the number of papers has gone up. And the hope is that we can grow a vibrant community. As we allude to in our ISR editorial, we think that it's one of the differentiators for our field. And in fact, backstory, this editorial, when we asked for feedback, Nick is the person who said, "This is what you need to say in there, that design is one of the things that separates IS, frankly, from other areas, right? Is this other fields don't do it." I think in terms of advice, the thing that I believe some, especially computational design researchers, struggle with a little bit is that that ability to connect with the broader conversation, right? And I think that for me, my PhD minor was cognitive science. I went into psychology and took any class I could where they were doing experiments or where they were doing like prospect theory type stuff and Tversky and Kahneman. And so trying to embrace, if you're a technical person, trying to embrace the socio half of it, right? I
Yeah,
think is
like
so
pick
crucial.
a discourse to know outside because you're technical. You want to do the technical stuff. You don't want to do
Yeah, that's the
not you
duck that cannot
specifically.
walk argument, right? We're making the ducks walk argument, right? So,
Mm.
so like on you're saying, look, they need to be better steeped in theory. The other, against prejudice I've heard is the design people are poor at the methods. So they do evaluations, but they do them poorly. The experiments are poorly designed, or, like they do a really stupid case study or focus group or whatever, and they're just poorly done. That's the other argument I've heard as well.
That's a fair point. And I think those types of stereotypes exist also for other fields, but you're right. That's definitely the challenge that they would want to overcome. But yeah, no, I think validity is a big challenge for sure. And it goes back to something, and I think I don't know if it was I think it was Isaac or someone who said it. Like, but this is a broader microcosm of it. But there was I think it's a 2003 MISQ paper where Ben Bassat he talks about how technical researchers are basically technophiles at heart, right? And so you just want to build cool stuff, and then we're like, okay, we're done with this. Like, we just want to move on. And that process of the pain of going through those rounds is hard. And the other challenge, which we do allude to in this ISR paper, which I do think maybe is more unique to qualitative and technical research, more so than behavioral and empirical, is if the reviewers don't like what you're doing, they want you to go back and significantly change it. That can be really hard, right? Like, it can be hard to go back and be like, go to the organization and rebuild this system. Right. And that's like with qualitative. Sometimes it's not easy to go back and do another 15-month data collection. Right. And that's hard.
Yeah.
Agree.
So advice. So what I guess get better at theory, get better at methods. That's our advice for young people that want to design and build stuff.
But I also think depth in the method, technical side too. I mean, I think that we're like, what's your edge, right? I mean, if you're going to be doing computational research, I've actually started. So when I first started as an assistant professor, in addition to my reviewing a ton of papers for MISQ, ISR, et cetera, as a junior faculty member, I still was on the program committees for some of the top computer science conferences. And that was because I wanted to keep my edge there, because for me, I love some of the machine learning methods. And then I stopped doing that, right? Because being an AE, SE, et cetera, it's a lot of work. About 5 years ago, I started again. And it was because I felt like I was losing my understanding of what that community was doing,
wow.
right? And so I'm on the program committees for all the ACL conferences. I review the minimum amount you can review is 4 papers per cycle. So I'm reviewing about 16 to 20 papers a year at least for those conferences. And it's nice because you realize that, interestingly enough, those communities are starting to move more towards the social, humanistic, downstream implications, which they didn't used to do. And then you start to say, okay, what's our edge, right? What are we going to do better than them? Yeah. They're starting to abstract more too.
Yeah.
So I mean, one trend that I see, and please disconfirm it, is that I think Shirley and others, they call it acceptation, right? The idea like you take let's say computational method, like double debiased machine learning, and your contribution is that you bring it into IS and you apply it to some, problem domain here, right? And I would say that at the moment, most of the papers that I get to see, they're doing that. Is that fair to say? Am I mischaracterizing it? Like, bring in some computer science, computation, super cool method, usually machine learning, could be topic modeling, could be sentiment, could be whatever, and then bring it in and apply it to some business problem and show that you solve it better than whatever other methods we used to have.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly right. I mean, the question becomes what's our differentiator, what's our edge? Because again, and this is really the crux of this ISR editorial that Nick alluded to with Jeff, and we were so lucky to have Jeff and Olivia and Gotham and Supra on it. But we basically analyzed about 300 manuscripts submitted to ISR that were design oriented over the last 10 years, because many of us have been there that long in editing roles. And we came up with these 6 or so very common issues. And it was sort of the idea was sort of inspired by something Arun did with one of his editorials many years ago, right? Like the type 3 errors paper. That's really a really good paper. And we didn't want to reinvent the wheel and do the same thing, but we wanted these 6 things that were unique to design. So those issues that he covered I think, apply to all kinds of research, right? Classic pitfalls. There's electricity in my kitchen or whatever. Like, I mean,
gravity in the kitchen,
things, right?
Gravity in the
gravity
kitchen.
in my kitchen. Yeah.
Street light effect.
Street light effect. I mean,
Goldilocks
those are classic pitfalls.
principle.
Yes.
Goldilocks.
Yes.
That's the 2017
yeah.
rye.
But anyway, so in our case, the 6, we wanted to make sure we purposefully didn't want those again, because those apply to everything. So the 6 we found, one of them was exactly what you just alluded to, though, Jan, which was that, and I think we called it like conflating like domain application versus domain adaptation, right? And what we say is
nice.
Domain application is where I take, I study a context and I've got this artifact and it works in that context, and my gap is the context. But domain adaptation is where specific characteristics of the context interact with my artifact in ways that are theoretically, conceptually meaningful, such that my design knowledge, my prescriptive knowledge that I get from it somehow is informed, right? Beyond, and it can't just be, oh, look, it also works in this context, right? That was if you go back historically, that was one of the knocks on the TAM stuff, right? It was like, oh, look, here's the 500th context where usefulness and ease of use are valuable. And that sort of hurts the entire cumulative tradition, because you get fatigue around it and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm jumping a little bit. I want to go back to ask you one more thing about your forthcoming MSQ paper, because it's an issues and opinion paper, and they're different, right? Writing them, getting them through the review process is different, and one might say they're actually really, really hard, right? So we always say, like, look, theoretical papers are hard because you don't have any empirics to fall back on. Well, issues and opinion is an issue, and your opinion, and convincing anyone that your opinion is worth hearing is very, very difficult to do, right? And when I was reading yours, I got reminded of it's not of the same quality or anything, but this issues opinion paper we wrote that was rejected at MISQ, ended up at JIS, about null hypothesis testing in IS. So we did something similar in a way that we looked at what were people doing, and we were concerned about certain issues. And in our case, they were more about p-hacking, threshold-based reporting, and sort of over-interpreting and conflating effect sizes with practical importance, these sorts of things, right? Anyway, so what I wanted to ask you is, in that review process, the reviewers were very concerned with us portraying a negative and overly critical message, like lamenting that our colleagues are bad scientists, so to speak, because they did all these errors, right? So we had to write extremely carefully, and we had to make sure that we were really, really constructive. And in a way, like there's even a paragraph in the paper that we're not trying to, be anxious and be critical about the quality, but sort of like moving things forward. And I wanted to ask you whether you had the same experience. And just in general, how was the experience of publishing an INO paper? Because I don't think that many people, know about how this works.
Yeah, no, I think your experience is very similar. I mean, the first thing to know about an INO is it has to be invited by the EIC. And so at the time, Andrew Burton-Jones was the person who invited this, and him and I have had some conversations about this, and he's even wrote an editorial a while ago where he was talking about things he's concerned about, and one of those was that is big tech the big, I think he called it big tobacco or big pharma, and those types of analogies of our time, because they have so much power and influence. And a trend that we have all noted is, I don't know about you guys, but when I go to give invited talks, I probably get more questions from junior faculty just about how do you have all these industry connections, more so than sometimes about the questions we're asking and the insights we're trying to provide. And to a point, and of course, we want our field to be rigorous and relevant. And relevance we've become very relevant, and that's great. But I think that was the backdrop, right? And so it started with that. But with an INO, the other thing is, as you know, you get really senior reviewers, right? So every reviewer and we don't know who they are, but like presumably you can just tell from the comments you get, these are senior people, right? And absolutely, we got hit hard on the one. And by the way, the process was fantastic. It was brutal. It was probably the most difficult, challenging process I've ever experienced for a paper. But I think, I can appreciate it. Even as it's happening, you're like, okay, this is the way it should be going. It should be difficult. The reason we wanted to call this an issues and opinions, by the way, was we didn't want to focus just on the methodological aspect. And that's why that section's very small. We wanted to focus on what's new here and why it matters. And to us, it was the fact that there's intentionality behind this, right? So these tech platforms, they're doing this on purpose because they have a practical problem that they wanted to solve. And to us, it highlights the difference between the dichotomy that we need to be mindful of. Even though we're in a relevant field, we need to be doing things that industry values. We love industry, but that there is this delineation and those lines are getting blurred. Like too often we think that the A/B test, what Nick was saying earlier, I don't agree with that. I actually think a lot of foundational research has come from industry. I think, Google does a lot of really cool foundational science, actually, right? I mean, the Google Brain side, but we do need to be mindful of those things, right? And so that's why we called it an issues and opinions. But the review team, and they did the right thing. They really pushed us and said, well, but this phenomena, doesn't it manifest in other ways? And you mentioned earlier, Jan, you mentioned AMT, mechanical Turk, right? Well, the same Turker could be in many, many experiments within an hour, right? They're not just an experiment.
Or even literally in parallel, right?
Yes. And the
could be doing too.
Yeah.
Their bot could be doing
that. Exactly.
Their bot could be doing like 10 at the same time.
Yeah. Absolutely. Or someone could be experiencing Amazon and then Netflix. And the reviewers hit us with these really good things. And they're right. And that's why we said, look, it's not just about does confounding happen and how much it happens, although that's an interesting insight. It's the fact that this is intentional. Like the industry has been pretty clear that they're doing this and why they're doing it. And for us, we need to recognize that dichotomy. And that was why we thought it was an issues and opinions piece.
Yeah. So listen, Wrecker, I know we have to wrap up, but I'll tell you, now you see why I'm so fortunate to have Abbasi as my colleague, right? He's like the smartest guy in every room, true scholar. It's wonderful. But yeah, thanks for coming on board, dude.
Hey, just so people get a glimpse of that, right? So we talked about several of your works, but this is by happenstance. This morning I was actually doing research and I saw the June issue of ISR. And then I saw your name again, and apparently you're also an expert on disaster management. I was like, what is this guy not good at? You're like, in Germany, we would say you're a Tausendsasser, like a jack of all trades. I don't know whether that covers that, but you have an impressive range. Jesus Christ, yeah.
Yeah. He knows his stuff, this Abbasi guy. Yeah. Well, anyway, thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for all that you do. This is a great podcast, and I think it's great for the field. I mean, we'll probably do this over a beer, but like the number of stories I get, like the field knows me through how you guys mention me, by the way. So,
I very much doubt that.
No, I quite literally mean it. I don't know who I was talking to. I was at ISIS in Cyprus, and people keep count of who you mention and how much. And so apparently me and Stefan are held in high regard in Nick's mentions. And so that means we're decent scholars. So
we gotta get
this power, monetize it, get your t-shirts, but also, please podcast responsibly.
So first of all, Ahmed paid us money. We paid Ahmed money to say that. Second, I think someone should do an analysis of people we mentioned and the way the citation count of these people go up.
Oh, geez, you're so, yeah. All right.
Well, people look for topics. I'm handing out free research topics. Surely an ISIS paper in such
we could do an A/B test. Let's do an A/B test. We'll mention people and see what happens.
No, but I'm really first of all, congratulations on that piece. I mean, ever since 2 years ago, and I really mean that. Like, it's not that often that you hear about work and that you keep remembering that for 2 years and waiting for the paper to come out. That's very impressive, as is the rest of the work. And I'm pretty sure it leaves a mark. Thanks for coming on, man. I mean, you're doing many things.
We'll do it again next year when he publishes another 3 seminal papers. We'll get him on again. Talk about
that sounds like a plan. All right, guys, It was a pleasure. See you next time.